Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing Little Women, written by Louisa May Alcott. And this was originally published in 2 volumes. Volume 1 was published in 1868, and Volume 2 in 1869. And interestingly, I actually never had to read this book in high school or in college. And I'm sure this was a big book, especially in gender studies. But I first read it on my own just a few years ago. And what's funny is that I actually already knew about a few major plot points from this book, because if you watch the show Friends, there's that one episode from season 3 called The One Where Monica and Richard Are Friends. And in that one, there's a subplot with Rachel and Joey, where Rachel has Joey read Little Women and she has to read The Shining. And so then they are spoiling the books for each other. So then there are a few major story elements in this book that she spoils. Like, Beth dies, just a few things. So already going into it, I knew about a few major things. But what are you going to do? So this was now my second time reading it. And it's funny how it sort of felt like the first time reading it, because there was much that I didn't remember besides, again, a few major plot points. But it's such a lovely, beautifully written book. And oddly enough, Louisa May Alcott, she only wrote it because it was at the request of her publisher. And she took from her own childhood and adolescence, because it's loosely based on her growing up with her own 3 sisters. So a lot of real life experiences, as what many authors do, obviously, because as they say, write what you know. And then, with the success of this book, there were 2 follow-ups. There was Little Men, published in 1871, and Joe's Boys, published in 1886. So I haven't read either of those 2, but I read a little bit about what they're about because I was curious. And it's basically just with them as adults and their children, things like that. But as I said, this is a classic, even though Louisa May Alcott said that to her it was kind of dull, because it is ordinary. That's the thing. It's just these ordinary women. Just these girls growing into womanhood and learning from childhood into adolescence, just the things that we all go through when growing up, learning about ourselves. And each of the March sisters, they all have their own vices, certainly, but they all have their own admirable qualities as well. So to me, personally, there's something I can admire about each one of the March sisters. And of course, the March sisters are Margaret, Meg March, Josephine, Jo March, Elizabeth, Beth March, and Amy, Curtis March. And when we meet them, they are lamenting about Christmas, how it won't be Christmas without any presents. And then we just kind of learn about each of their defining characteristics and what each of them looks like. And this book is told in first-person point of view, with basically Louisa May Alcott kind of just voicing her thoughts here and there, because right away in the first chapter of the novel, titled Playing Pilgrims, where the narrator says, "As young readers like to know how people look, we will take this moment to give them a little sketch of the 4 sisters, who sat knitting away in the twilight, while the December snow fell quietly without, and the fire crackled cheerfully within." So then she goes on to explain about each of the 4 March sisters, and she says, "Margaret, the eldest of the 4, was 16 and very pretty, being plump and fair, with large eyes, plenty of soft brown hair, a sweet mouth, and white hands, of which she was rather vain. 15-year-old Jo was very tall, thin, and brown, and reminded one of a colt, for she never seemed to know what to do with her long limbs, which were very much in her way. She had a decided mouth, a comical nose, and sharp gray eyes, which appeared to see everything, and were by turns fierce, funny, or thoughtful." And then, going on to talk about Beth, Elizabeth, or Beth, as everyone called her, was a rosy, smooth-haired, bright-eyed girl of 13, with a shy manner, a timid voice, and a peaceful expression which was seldom disturbed. Her father called her Little Tranquillity, and the name suited her excellently, for she seemed to live in a happy world of her own, only venturing out to meet a few whom she trusted and loved. Amy, though the youngest, was a most important person, in her own opinion at least. A regular snow maiden with blue eyes and yellow hair curling on her shoulders, pale and slender, and always carrying herself like a young lady mindful of her manners. What the characters of the four sisters were, we will leave to be found out. So what I particularly admire about each of the four March sisters is how right away they realize that they want to be better. They don't want to be selfish or vain or feeling like, since they do live in poverty, that even in these early chapters of the novel, when they go to their neighbors, and since they are even poorer than they are, and they take their food to them for Christmas, just giving what little they have, because they look up to their mother, also named Margaret, but they call her Marmee. So that's really sweet and something to absolutely admire, that they all want to better themselves. Even though, as we learn, that Jo in particular is basically rebellious and quote-unquote boyish, like she likes to whistle, and they're saying, "Don't whistle, Jo, it's so boyish." Just things like that. Or how Meg is vain and basically jealous of other people with expensive, glorious, luxurious clothing, things like that. Or Amy, how she gets jealous really easily, but then, for instance, how she doesn't like her nose. Or then, of course, Beth, who's just really shy and quiet and needs to learn how to blossom and be more outspoken. So then Beth really looks up to her older sister Jo in particular, and Amy really looks up to Meg in particular. And Jo is, of course, really the true heroine of the story. We really see her, how she has this truly strong bond with each of her sisters in particular. Even though the four of them, of course, they are their own, like within the family of the March sisters, those four, they have that unbreakable bond as sisters. And then, of course, there is another important character in this novel, Theodore Lawrence, who goes by Laurie because he doesn't like the nickname Teddy, even though when Jo meets him, because Jo and Meg go to that party for New Year's Eve, and then she meets Laurie, and then finding out that he is their next door neighbor. He lives with his grandfather, and he is rich, so he goes by Laurie instead of being called Teddy. So then Jo is the only one who calls him Teddy. So they form this real connection and this friendship. And then there's the whole thing with the budding romance, but it's strictly on Laurie's side. It's one-sided, this romance, that he, throughout the novel, is developing feelings for Jo, but she doesn't feel the same way. She loves him as a brother, as a friend. And I'm sure that's certainly disputed a lot, even to this day, because Louisa May Alcott herself had said that she wasn't going to have Jo and Laurie marry just because everyone seems to think that that was where it was heading. So I definitely respect and admire that as well. I like that it didn't end up that way, because I was spoiled by Rachel in Friends, where she says that Laurie was in love with Jo, but then he ends up marrying Amy, so I already knew that too going in. But obviously, this is much more than that plot point with the romance and them marrying, because, in fact, Louisa May Alcott herself hadn't married, but she based Laurie on a childhood friend, just someone she was really close to, even though she admitted, though, that he was less developed compared to the March sisters, which makes sense, since that's the title, Little Women, following the March siblings, each of these four young women. So then we get to see, though, here and there, how they take their weaknesses and begin to turn them into strengths. First by when their mother gives them those books, and they're saying, "Oh, I'm going to read these, we're each going to read our books and just learn and try not to be thinking pessimistically and just trying to better themselves." So then Beth, for instance, when she really comes into her own, when Laurie's grandfather basically invites her because she loves the piano that they have, and then he invites her to come and play anytime she wants. and she's just so shy and meek, but then she finally takes him up on the offer, and then when he gives her the piano as a gift, and then she's like saying that she better go thank him, Joe's like suggests she thanks him, and then when she goes there, and then they just can't believe that she goes up to the grandfather, gives him a big kiss and hug, and he in particular has the connection with Beth because he's reminded of his child who had long passed. So just them slowly, even early on, just slowly but surely becoming stronger, becoming more confident. And then Meg, being the eldest, she marries first when she meets that man, John Brooke, who is in fact a tutor to Laurie, and then he just falls in love with Meg first. And then when he has her glove, and then when Laurie confides to Joe that John has been carrying around Meg's glove, and Joe just doesn't like it at all because Joe talks about how love is such a silly thing and makes girls act so silly and blushing and just not at all themselves, and she's just very much against all of that, all the romanticized things about love and falling in love. And she's steadfast about not wanting anything to do with it, and how it's going to slowly break apart their family because then, Meg will get married, and then she obviously won't, she'll just be with her husband then have her own children. So she's just very adamant and very against all that. But then she has to come to terms with it when then Meg begins to develop feelings for John, and then when he declares his love to her and wants her to give him a chance, and first she just kind of turns him away, but then she realizes she does care for him, and it's all because of their great aunt March, who's basically saying like, you shouldn't marry him because he's poor, and she realizes that that doesn't matter to her, that she does love and care for him. And then Amy also, early on there's a chapter where the whole thing with the limes, when she, like with the girls, and like they trade limes and things like that, and then one by one the teacher didn't like it, and she was hiding her limes and she had to throw them out one by one. And then another pivotal scene really in the entire novel though is the conflict with Joe and Amy early on, when first Amy is jealous because Joe was going to a show with Meg and Laurie, and then she was saying, well, you can't come because you weren't invited. And then she gets so jealous and angry that she takes Joe's manuscript and burns it, which another plot point I remember they mentioned in Friends. Keep going back to that, and then that's just so obviously cruel and truly mean. And of course Joe, rightfully so, is angered by that and refusing to forgive Amy. But then when they go ice skating and then Amy ends up falling through the ice, and then when Laurie's there, then Laurie just is frantic and then telling Joe to help him save Amy, and then they just pull her out of the ice, and she could have basically died of hypothermia, and which is crazy. And then when Joe is talking to their mother and saying how I was so angry at Amy I wouldn't even talk to her and I almost lost her, and then her mother, what I respect too about the mother is how, again, what I respect about parent characters when they treat their children not just as their children but as people, as their own human beings with their own mistakes and their own flaws. In other words, how she treats her with her own respect and as a little woman, as they all are little women, that she knows her children aren't perfect and she can only do so much instilling her own values and lessons in each one of them in hopes that they will learn and grow and prosper. So then by the end of that chapter, when Marmee confides to Joe that I understand you have a short temper, that's something you need to work on, and that I understand that because I myself have that, and then Joe is surprised, like, really, you, mother? And just talking with one another, being relatable and real and honest, and that it helps her realize, like, don't let the sun set on your anger, so to speak. And then that's when they finally make up, Amy and Joe, and they just embrace, realizing that she had to forgive for her own sake, because then that anger would have just eaten away at her, and then if something tragic would have happened, then she would have felt guilty the rest of her life. So then her mother sees, in particular with Joe, that turning point for her as she begins to realize that she needs to not be so hot-headed and learn to forgive as she does in that case. So that too is another admirable quality. And then there's that other great chapter, Castles in the Air, when they all talk about their dreams and what they hope for themselves. And Amy, for instance, wanting to be an artist. And of course Jo with her writing. And then Meg with what she really wants, just a happy, fulfilled life. And then Beth just wanting everyone to be happy and together, and she's content with living at home. So that, of course, is a bit of foreshadowing, sadly, with Beth. But then they talk about how they can get the keys to their castles in the air. And Jo talking about how for her it's her pen, so to speak, with writing. And with Amy it's her pencil with drawing. So just the symbolism there, I really love all of that as well. And how they can reach their goals. How they can grow, each one of them, to reach their goals. So then part 1 ends with Meg accepting John's marriage proposal. And then also before that, though, when it's a year has passed, and another absolutely lovely moment in this novel when their father returns home, because before that he was wounded, and then the mother was instructed to come at once. So then they were all worrying and praying that he would survive, that he wouldn't die. And then thankfully, after time has passed, and then he comes home for Christmas. And it's such a touching, joyous, beautiful moment when Laurie comes in and he says, "Here's another Christmas present for the March family." Before the words were well out of his mouth, he was whisked away somehow, and in his place appeared a tall man, muffled up to the eyes, leaning on the arm of another tall man, who tried to say something and couldn't. Of course there was a general stampede, and for several minutes everybody seemed to lose their wits, for the strangest things were done, and no one said a word. Mr. March became invisible in the embrace of 4 pairs of loving arms. Jo disgraced herself by nearly fainting away, and had to be doctored by Laurie in the china closet. Mr. Brooke kissed Meg entirely by mistake, as he somewhat incoherently explained, and Amy, the dignified, tumbled over a stool, and never stopping to get up, hugged and cried over her father's boots in the most touching manner. Mrs. March was the first to recover herself, and held up her hand in a warning, "Hush, remember Beth." But it was too late. The study door flew open. The little red wrapper appeared on the threshold. Joy put strength into the feeble limbs, and Beth ran straight into her father's arms. Never mind what happened just after that, for the full hearts overflowed, washing away the bitterness of the past and leaving only the sweetness of the present. Because while the mother had gone to take care of the father, then that's when Beth had first gotten sick with scarlet fever, but then thankfully she got well that first time. And then also there was the whole part with Jo cutting off her hair to just have it sold, to just have some more money for the family. So it just shows the great lengths she goes to for her family, and that's so touching too. And then when she just is crying though, and then Meg's saying, "What's wrong, Jo?" And she's saying, "It's my hair," when she just genuinely laments missing her vanity, her hair. But again, it's those truly selfless, kind-hearted acts. And then it is rewarded when their father returns home, and it's just so sweet. And then he sees the progress that each of them has made. And then volume 1 ends, "So grouped, the curtain falls upon Meg, Jo, Beth, and Amy. Whether it ever rises again depends upon the reception given to the first act of the domestic drama called Little Women." And then volume 2, which was published the following year, begins 3 years later with Meg's wedding, when she marries John Brooke. So then now with Meg, she's experiencing married life for the first time, and all the domestic cares, and how she has her own little home now. And then she's learning how to be a good wife to John, and take his feelings into account, and learn her own humility. And then she takes more advice from her mother, with her mother saying that in arguments you have to sometimes put away your pride and really take ownership and responsibility, and even if you don't feel like you're wrong, that you have to apologize and be humble. And then they go on to have 2 children, 2 twins in fact, Daisy and Demi. even though Daisy, her real name is actually Margaret for the mom, and then they just call her Daisy. And then the other one is named John after the father, but then they call him Demi John, so then Daisy and Demi for short. So that's really sweet. And then Amy, meanwhile, still pursuing her artistic endeavors. And then Jo, there are several times throughout this novel where she writes these sensation stories, and then when first she's published and they're all so proud of her, but then she's also doing it because she's spurred by when Beth begins to go in decline with her health, sadly, again, and then she realizes she needs to help any way she can by making more money, so then she's writing these stories that she necessarily doesn't even like herself. And then when Amy, she gets to go overseas with Aunt March, and then Jo would have gotten to go, but then because she was all petulant saying that she didn't care for all the travels, then she missed out. So then Amy gets to go abroad, traveling to Paris and London, all these beautiful places. And then, of course, it's so tragic and touching and heartbreaking when Beth passes away, but then she's comforted in knowing that she helped brighten each of her sisters' lives, and that even though she was always shy and quiet and not exactly living an ambitious life, because she confesses to Jo that she felt she would never live long, that she was just meant to be here for a short time. And Jo obviously is heartbroken, and she was determined to see Beth get better. But then she comes to terms with it, and then Beth says how death won't part them, that she'll always be her sister, that she'll always be there, and that Jo now has to be there for their parents and just keep living and pursuing everything she wants to pursue, and just take her in her heart, like just carry her spirit on in her heart. And then before that, though, there's the whole thing with Laurie when he confesses his love to Jo, and Jo is just adamant about saying that she can't love him that way, that she wishes she could, but she just doesn't feel that way about him. And then there was also a part when Jo confides to their mother that she needs to go away for a while because she fears that Laurie's becoming too attached. And then when she goes to New York, that's when she meets the professor, Frederick Baer, just the German professor, very genial and kind, even though he is poor, but his students love him. He's just a really genuine, nice man. There begins to be a friendship between Jo and the professor. But when Jo talks to the mother first about Laurie, and she says, "I'm glad you don't intend to marry him," and she wants to know why, and she says, "Because you two are too similar, both headstrong, that they just wouldn't have gotten along if they got married, that they were just, because they just would butt heads, because they are similar in a lot of ways." And he is stubborn and immature in his own way, Laurie, though he is intelligent, but he needs that push. So again, I like that it didn't go with the route that you would think it would go with the two of them falling in love, because I genuinely didn't feel the love from Jo to Laurie. I don't feel it that way. I could see why she doesn't love him that way, because when people are so set in their ways in a lot of ways, and how with Jo, it's more so that she has love of a mother in a sense with him. That's the impression I get anyway, that she calls him her boy, and she's the only one that calls him Teddy. So even though he felt he was in love with her, then he's heartbroken, then he decides to go away with the grandfather, and that's when then he reconnects with Amy. So then at first, it thankfully didn't feel like him just settling with Amy. It was him genuinely moving on. That when he writes to Jo one more time saying, "Oh, could you, Jo?" And she's saying, "I'm sorry, I can't." Because at that time, that's when she was still taking care of Beth. So then Amy, while she's traveling, and then when she gets the news, and then she's getting comforted by Laurie, and then they begin to reconnect, and he begins to see her in a new light, as does she with him. Because prior to that, there were certain moments here and there, and even with them there was foreshadowing. With Meg's wedding, for instance, when he was saying to dance around the happy couple, and he was dancing with Amy. So then Amy and Laurie, just with their conversations and all traveling together, and then when she sees him being lazy, because yes, he graduated college, but then she was saying, "Well, that was expected of you. Now you need to go and do something great, do something to make her love you." And then she just sees him wasting away his days, and then she tells him, "Well, do you want to know what I think of you?" And he says, "Yes," pining to know. And she says, "Well, I despise you." And then that for him is a turning point where he realizes he wants to earn her affections, he wants to go and do something great to make her love him. And then when she's drawing and everything, saying, well, talent isn't enough to really make a career out of it. You need so much more than that. And then he's realizing when he's trying to do compositions, he realizes that it isn't enough. And then when they reconnect again and he realizes that he does in fact love Amy and she loves and admires him, they fall in love with each other. And when they basically confess their love, it's such a sweet scene when they're rowing out on the water, and it says, feeling that she had not mended matters much, Amy took the offered third of a seat, shook her hair over her face, and accepted an oar. She rowed as well as she did many other things, and though she used both hands, and Laurie but one, the oars kept time, and the boat went smoothly through the water. How well we pull together, don't we? Said Amy, who objected to silence just then. So well that I wish we might always pull in the same boat. Will you, Amy? Very tenderly. Yes, Laurie, very low. Then they both stopped rowing, and unconsciously added a pretty little tableau of human love and happiness to the dissolving views reflected in the lake. What a beautiful poetic way of saying they kissed. Just so sweet. So I did feel the connection with them, and I'm glad the two of them ended up together and that Jo didn't cave, and because then she begins to develop feelings for the professor, Jo, and he has that calming, gentle spirit that she very much needs. He also pushes her with saying how she shouldn't be writing these sensation stories, that she should write what she loves and believes in. So then when Amy and Laurie get married, and then when Laurie comes back and then she's saying, oh, you're not a boy anymore, you're a man, and then he's tells her that now Jo and Amy have switched places in his heart. So he's happy now that Jo is his sister for life, his sister-in-law. So that's really sweet too. I love that. How each one of these characters truly blossoms and grows, and it's so beautiful. And it's so well earned, since this is a lengthy novel for certain. So we really see them grow gradually throughout the years. And then it's lovely too when they decide, Laurie and Amy, to use their wealth to help those less fortunate, and it's just so sweet. So Amy truly has become much more selfless, letting her selfish ways from childhood really disappear. And then also with her art too, there's a lovely scene too when she shows Laurie the drawing she did of him, and he just admires it and saying, oh, how well you draw. But then he takes in how he looks so lazy in the picture, but again, a catalyst for change for him. And then Jo, when the professor comes to visit her, and then when she's upset because she thinks he's going to leave, and then there's a symbolism with the umbrella when he's saying, well, I can't have much to give, but I'll always be here for you, to like hold the umbrella for her when it's raining. And it's just so sweet too, because she loves him and he loves her, even though he's older than her, and she's saying that doesn't matter to her because he's intellectual and he's kind-hearted and he's humble, and they have that nice balance between the two of them, since she's much more brazen and bold. And then it's lovely too when they get together and it says, Jo never, never would learn to be proper, for when he said that as they stood upon the steps, let me backtrack. When he says, thou givest me such hope and courage, and I have nothing to give back but a full heart and these empty hands, cried the professor, quite overcome. Jo never, never would learn to be proper, for when he said that as they stood upon the steps, she just put both hands into his, whispering tenderly, not empty now, and stooping down, kissed her Frederick under the umbrella. It was dreadful, but she would have done it if the flock of draggle-tailed sparrows on the hedge had been human beings, for she was very far gone indeed, and quite regardless of everything but her own happiness, though it came in such a very simple guise, which was the crowning moment of both their lives, when, turning from the night and storm and loneliness to the household light and warmth and peace waiting to receive them, with a glad welcome home, Jo led her lover in and shut the door. So then the final chapter of the novel is again several years later, and we find out that after Aunt March had passed, that she left her land, Plumfield, I guess, to Jo, and that Jo decides to turn it into a house for unfortunate for just poor boys, and just because she wants to be a mother to like her own children, but also to boys that are orphans, so that she'll take care of them and then her professor will teach them. Basically a little prequel then for the following novel, Little Men, and then the following one after that, Joe's Boys. Because in those two, then it's just those children and then Joe raising them and things like that. But then she ends up having 2 boys of her own, Robin and Theodore Bear, who they called Rob and Teddy. And then Lori and Amy have a daughter, Elizabeth, who they call Bess for short. So then they're all gathered together, celebrating their mother's 60th birthday. Then they're picking apples, and it's all the March sisters with their husbands and their children now, and all the warmth and happiness. So yes, it is very saccharine and sweet, but that's just the lovely moments in life with your family and just people you love and care about. Just so sweet. And then it ends with just the sisters talking to their mother, and it says, "Touched to the heart, Mrs. March could only stretch out her arms as if to gather her children and grandchildren to herself, and say, with face and voice full of motherly love, gratitude, and humility, 'Oh, my girls, however long you may live, I never can wish you a greater happiness than this.'" So it's just so beautiful and wonderful. And it was just such a lovely thing to watch each of these characters grow and just use their own life lessons and apply it to our own lives. So a truly wonderful, absolutely timeless, beautiful book. And with that, that is going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com, or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, the things I do for love. I'll be discussing Courage the Cowardly Dog. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.